everyone, I'm Apero. I'm a member of Team Aretusa, and today I'll be running you through my top 5 tips for how to beat Enslave. Now, we see a lot of videos about how to play certain decks, not a lot about how to beat them. So I thought today we'd just have a look at some of my ideas on what you can do to improve your techniques against Enslave. And this video is suitable mostly for beginners, so if you're already very familiar with Enslave, its abilities, its strategy, then probably this isn't the video for you. However, if you're still struggling to understand what your goal is when playing against this deck, then hopefully you find these tips useful. Let's get into it. Now, the main thing about Enslave decks is that it involves a lot of seize abilities. The first one is, of course, the leader. So the number one thing you should do when playing against an Enslave deck is to check the leader and see what level of card they can seize. Normally it will be either a 5 or a 6, depending on how many tactics are in their deck. The other seize ability that they have is Swears, and Swears is able to seize a unit worth 3 power or less. There are 2 things you can do to defend yourself against these seize abilities. The first thing is to boost something out of range so that they can't seize it. Put simply, if you have a 7-point unit, they can't seize it with a 6-point leader, nor with Swears. So if you have something that you really want to protect, then that's probably the best strategy for you. And saving tactical advantage to do something like that is a very common way of avoiding those seize abilities. The other way to avoid seize abilities is actually to bait them out. And the way to do this is simply to present a very juicy little target. Unfortunately, the difficulty with that play is that most Nilfgaard players are already familiar with most meta decks. That's part of what makes Nilfgaard so much fun to play, is that you do have to understand the decks you're playing against. So they probably already know which cards of yours are the most useful, and they will be saving those seize abilities to take those cards away from you, or potentially to use them for themselves as well. So although you can try to bait it out with something less useful, they're not always going to take that bait. So certainly try to avoid the seize abilities more by boosting or by using one of your defenders in order to avoid those steals. My second tip for playing against an Enslave deck is simply to play around Assassination. Now, if you don't know already, Assassination is a card which basically destroys a unit worth 6 points or less if it's alone on the row. Now, its damage is lessened by 1 point for each unit it's played next to. So if you have a card next to another card, then you can only hit that by 5, not by 6. If you have a card in between 2 units, then you can only hit it by 4 with Assassination. It's very important that if you have a card that is worth 6 points or 5 points, you play it in between 2 other units. And it's also very important to remember that artifacts do not count towards that number, and that includes tactical advantage. If you play a 6-point unit next to tactical advantage, or portal, for example, as well, then you will be susceptible to assassination. So if you have a very important engine or a target that you want to survive for just 1 round, maybe to get off its orders or similar, then it's important that you play it either next to 1 unit or 2 units, depending on how many points that unit is worth. My third tip is pretty simple, and it is this. Save some of your removal for round 3. When I say removal, I mean units that can inflict damage or destroy other units. One of the reasons for this is that a very commonly run card in this deck is Damien. And what Damien does is it refreshes their leader ability. So if you thought them stealing one of your 5 or 6 point units was annoying the first time, you definitely don't want them doing it a second time. Damien is one of these units that takes 1 turn to activate. It's an orders card. So if you have removal on hand, you can get rid of him. He's only worth 5 points, but you have to save that removal to do so. In a similar vein, my fourth tip involves saving a Purify. The reason for this is that almost all Enslave decks will run Fion the Defender. Now, if you don't have a Purify, then you won't be able to use that removal to target something like Damien. So let's say they play Fion, you don't Purify it, and then they play Damien. Tough luck, saving that removal has now done nothing because you can't target Damien. So it's very important that if you haven't seen the Defender yet, you hold on to that Purify, especially if you are intending to destroy their Damien or even their Skellen. My fifth and final tip could really be applied to playing against any Nilfgaard deck, and that is to alternate your high and low power units on a row. The reason for this is the card Treason, which damages your units on either side of one unit by the power of that unit. It's kind of hard to explain, but let's put it this way. If you had a 5, a 1, and a 5, then you could target the 1 with Treason and it would hit both 5s by 1 each, and they would each go down to 4. So obviously that's not a huge impact, but what happens if you're playing an 8 next to a 10 next to a 6? Then suddenly both the 8 and the 6 can be hit by 10 power each, and they have just achieved 14 points of damage. So to avoid this, we alternate high power units and low power units to minimize the damage that can actually be done. Well, that's it, guys. Those are my top 5 tips for dealing with Enslave. It won't be much new information for those who have been more experienced with the game, but for newbies and those who might just be struggling with this deck and just be encountering it for the first time, hopefully these tips will save you some games. Now, I should add a little extra bonus tip, which applies to any deck. Facing any deck, what is most important and what will help you the most is knowing it. And I cannot recommend the Team Aretuza Meta Snapshot enough for this purpose. You go into the Meta Snapshot, it's got a list of all the most popular and powerful decks in the game right now. Read through them, see what their strategies are, see what the combos are, get to know them, and then you will have a better idea about whether you want a long round or a short round, whether you want to target a certain card or save your damage for a different card, or what combos you might want to interrupt. That's kind of my tip every single time for every single deck, but it still applies here. There is a link to the Team Aretuza Meta Snapshot down there, and it is definitely worth checking out. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this useful, and if you did, please do hit the subscribe button. Thanks so much. Bye.